The house was quiet that night. The kind of quiet that settles deep into the walls and floors, the kind that feels heavier than silence. Our home was an old two-story farmhouse with creaky wooden floors and narrow hallways that always seemed colder than the rest of the house. The dim light from the hallway lamp flickered weakly, casting long shadows that stretched across the peeling wallpaper. I remember the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant ticking of the clock in the living room. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, but inside, everything was still. My family had a routine. Dinner was usually at 6, and after that, my parents would retreat to their bedroom. I'd finish my homework at the small desk in the corner of the living room, while my older brother, Nathan, disappeared into the shed behind the house or wandered outside on his long walks. He was always quiet, never much for conversation. His room was at the end of the hallway, far from mine. The walls between our rooms were thin, and I could sometimes hear the creak of his bed or the soft thud of his footsteps. That night, I was sitting on the couch when I heard the front door open. Nathan had come home late. His boots thudded heavily on the porch, and I caught the faint smell of dirt and something metallic on his clothes. He didn't look at me. His eyes were fixed on the floor as he slipped inside, closing the door quietly behind him. I watched him walk down the hallway toward the back of the house, his shoulders tense and his movements sharp, almost hurried. Without a word, he headed toward the shed. I followed at a distance, curiosity pulling me outside. The cold air hit my face as I stepped onto the porch. The night was darker than usual, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. Nathan stood by the shed, fumbling with the lock. When he finally clicked it shut, he turned to me. His eyes met mine for just a moment. There was something in that look, a warning I didn't understand then, something that made my stomach twist. He said nothing, just stepped back inside the house and locked the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through my jacket, the house behind me silent but for the faint creaks and groans of settling wood. That was the night I realized the person I lived with was capable of things I never imagined. The unease I felt wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was wrong. But I didn't know what. Not yet. Before we move deeper into what's unfolding, stay with me. There are details coming that will change everything you think you know about that night. The truth isn't simple, and the answers lie just beyond the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Keep watching, because what happens next will pull back the curtain on the shadows that have been quietly gathering. The silence inside the house stretched uncomfortably long as I stood rooted to the spot. The cold air wrapped around me like a warning I couldn't ignore. Every instinct screamed that something was off, that the man I thought I knew was hiding something darker than I could comprehend. But the house gave nothing away, no clues, no sign of what was really going on behind those locked doors. I decided to move closer, not because I wanted to confront him, but because I needed to understand. The faint light from the street lamp cast long shadows across the porch, and every step toward the house felt heavier than the last. The creaks in the floorboards, the distant hum of the night, it all seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to catch any sound, any hint of what might be happening inside. But there was only silence. That silence was the loudest thing in the world. It told me that whatever was coming next wouldn't be easy to face. I had to prepare myself, even if I didn't know what to expect. Because the night was far from over, and the secrets I was about to uncover would force me to question everything I thought was real. Growing up with my older brother was a slow rhythm of ordinary days that, in hindsight, held small details I didn't fully understand. Our house was quiet most of the time, not because there was anything wrong, but because that's just the way he was. My parents often described him as private or quiet, words that made it seem like he was simply shy or thoughtful. I didn't question it much. I was younger and accepted what I was told, while my brother kept to himself in ways that seemed normal for a kid who liked his own space. Mornings started the same way. I'd wake up to the sound of my mom in the kitchen, the smell of toast or pancakes drifting through the hallway. My brother was usually already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table, staring down at his cereal without much expression. Sometimes he'd hum softly, a low, steady sound that was just loud enough to fill some of the silence, but not enough to really draw attention. When my mom asked him if he wanted to talk about his day at school, he'd just shake his head or give a short, quiet answer. It was fine, or same as usual. Nothing more. School was a place where he blended into the background. Teachers called him reserved, and classmates described him as a little distant. I remember that he never really joined in on group activities or team sports. He preferred drawing or reading in the corner, and he sometimes spent recess alone, sitting beneath a tree or on the steps. It wasn't that unusual. Plenty of kids like to be alone sometimes. But there were moments when he seemed almost detached, like he was watching everything instead of participating. I didn't know how to interpret that then, so I just thought he was quiet. At home, he had his own routines that didn't always make sense to me. For example, he was very particular about how his belongings were arranged. I remember one afternoon when I accidentally moved one of his books from the spot where he'd left it on his desk. He noticed immediately, his face tightening for a moment before he quietly put the book back. It wasn't a big scene, but the intensity in his eyes lingered longer than I expected. My parents said it was just him being particular, but it stuck with me as something different. He also had habits like checking the locks on our doors multiple times before bedtime. I'd hear the creak of the front door handle as he tested it again, or the soft click of the back door latch. It wasn't that the neighborhood was dangerous, but maybe he just liked the reassurance. Sometimes when I asked why he did it, he'd say, "Just making sure." That was the extent of it. We didn't talk about why he felt the need to be so certain, and I didn't push. I learned early on that some things were better left unasked. On weekends, our family tried to stick to simple traditions. Saturday mornings might be pancakes, Sunday afternoons a walk in the park. My brother often declined to join these outings. He'd say he wanted to stay home and read or draw, and nobody pressed him. Even when he was just in the same room, he seemed to keep a distance, as if he was physically there but mentally somewhere else. Sometimes, I'd catch him staring out the window for long stretches, eyes unfocused, not really watching anything. I thought maybe he was just daydreaming. There were also moments when he acted differently, though they were subtle and easy to overlook. He could be very still for long periods, almost frozen, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. He didn't talk about his feelings or share much about what was going on inside his head. When he did speak, it was often in a flat or clipped tone, like he was reading from a script. These small things, at the time, seemed like quirks or just part of his personality. Looking back, I notice how he avoided eye contact when asked direct questions, how he sometimes flinched at sudden noises or unexpected touches. He was rarely angry or loud. Instead, his odd behaviors were quiet and contained. The adults in my life didn't see these as warning signs. They saw a boy who was reserved and private, maybe a little different, but nothing to be alarmed about. I trusted that, and so I didn't question it either. Living with him meant adapting to his silences and respecting his boundaries. I learned to read the unspoken cues, a change in his breathing, a shift in his posture, without knowing what they meant. Those small, silent moments filled much of our childhood, shaping the way I experienced our shared life, even if I didn't fully understand what I was seeing. That afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen table, the sun slanting through the window and making the linoleum floor look warmer than it felt. I was doing homework, trying to focus on the math problems, but the quiet in the house felt heavier than usual. He was there, in the living room, but I hadn't seen him move in a while. Just the low hum of the old refrigerator and the occasional creak from the floorboards filled the space. Then I heard a noise, something sharp, like the scrape of metal on wood. I glanced up, my pencil still in hand. He was standing by the doorway, his hand gripping the edge of the dining table. His knuckles were white, fingers clenched so tight the skin looked stretched. The room was still, except for his breathing, shallow, quick, almost like he was holding it. His eyes were fixed on the space above my head, but they weren't seeing me. They looked distant, but with a hard edge, like something was building inside him and waiting to break free. I said his name softly, barely above a whisper, but he didn't answer. Instead, he slammed his fist down on the table. The sound echoed, sharp and loud, making the pencil jump in my grip. I startled, my heart pounding. His face tightened, muscles twitching under the skin. His mouth was a thin line, lips pressed together so hard I could see the tension in his jaw. I didn't know what to do. I just watched. Then he turned to the window and slammed his other fist against the glass. The window rattled but didn't break. I could hear the neighbors outside, their voices faint but suddenly more present through the sudden noise. He didn't seem to notice. His whole body was rigid, shoulders squared, as if bracing for something I couldn't understand. I felt a knot twist in my stomach. I wanted to ask if he was okay, but the words stuck in my throat. I wanted to reach out to touch his arm, but my hands stayed frozen on the table. My mind raced, confused. This wasn't like him. Or maybe it was, and I just hadn't seen it before. I didn't know what I was afraid of exactly. The noise, the sudden anger, the way his face looked, like it was about to snap, but I knew something had changed. He didn't look at me again. Instead, he moved away from the window slowly, like he was calming down but still carrying something heavy inside. His breaths lengthened, but there was still a hardness in his eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there before. I pressed my hands together, my fingers trembling. The silence returned, but it felt different now. It felt like the quiet was holding something back, waiting. I sat there, my homework forgotten, staring at the spot where he had been. I wanted to understand what had just happened, but all I could feel was a tight, uneasy weight in my chest. The confusion mixed with a new kind of fear, a fear without a clear shape yet, but real enough to make my hands shake. I didn't know what he was capable of, but I knew something in him had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be able to look at him the same way again. It started with small observations, bits of routine I hadn't paid attention to before. He would disappear almost every evening around the same time, just after dinner, slipping out of the kitchen without saying much. Sometimes he carried a backpack, other times just a small toolbox or a plastic bag. I noticed the way his jaw would tighten when I asked where he was going, how he'd glance over his shoulder if I got too close. Not out of fear exactly, but as if he wanted me to know it was off limits, something private. The shed sat at the far edge of the backyard, half hidden by overgrown bushes and a sagging wooden fence that seemed to lean in with its own weight. I'd never been inside. It was always locked, the rusty padlock clicking shut behind him. Over the years, the paint peeled and chipped, exposing gray wood that looked brittle and splintered. The windows were small, dusty, and streaked with grime, making it impossible to see inside during the day. The air around it had a distinct smell, a mix of damp earth, old wood, and something metallic that I couldn't place, like forgotten tools left out to rust. I started timing his departures, marking them on the calendar in my head. Usually between 7:30 and 8 p.m. He'd stay inside for an hour or sometimes longer, emerging with his shirt slightly rumpled, sleeves rolled up, hands a little dirty or smudged with something I couldn't identify. Once or twice, I caught a glimpse of his face when he thought no one was looking, focused, almost tense, eyes narrowed as if working through something difficult or important. When I tried to follow him, the tension between us grew. He'd stop abruptly, turning to face me with a sharpness I'd never seen before. His voice, usually calm or indifferent, would harden. "Don't come in," he'd say quietly but firmly, the words hanging in the air like a warning. It wasn't anger exactly. More like a boundary being drawn, one I wasn't allowed to cross. I'd back off, my curiosity clawing at me, but the locked door stayed a barrier, physical and invisible. One afternoon, I approached the shed when I knew he was inside. The sun had just started to dip, casting long shadows across the yard. The temperature had dropped, but the air near the shed felt colder, thicker, almost still. I pressed my ear against the door, expecting to hear something, movement, voices, the scrape of tools, but there was only silence. Not even the creak of old wood settling. It was as if the space inside held its breath, waiting. Inside, I imagined the smell was stronger, dampness from the earth beneath the floorboards, the sharp scent of oil and metal, the dust that settled thick on every surface. I pictured old tools hanging on the walls, rusted nails and screws scattered on a workbench, a single bare bulb dangling from the ceiling. The air would be tight, cool, and stale, like the basement or a closet that never saw fresh air. I imagined the floorboards creaking underfoot, the smell of sawdust mixing with something faintly chemical, something I couldn't place but recognized as out of place in the quiet suburb. The more I watched from a distance, the more I realized how methodical he was about it. The way he arranged whatever he carried inside, the care he took locking the door, the way he checked the yard before slipping away. It felt deliberate, controlled. Like this shed was a world he retreated into, away from everyone else, including me. There was no mess, no loud noises, no signs of disorder. Just a locked room with a silence so thick it pressed against the windows and seeped into the grass. Each time he left, I was left standing there, wondering what he was doing in that space no one else was allowed to enter. The questions piled up, but the answers stayed locked tight with the door. And every time I thought I was close to finding out, the air between us grew colder, the distance wider, and the shed remained the last place he could disappear to without a trace. The night air bit sharply at my skin the moment I stepped outside, colder than I expected for early spring. My breath came out in short, visible bursts, the sound sharp against the quiet. I moved slowly, careful not to make a sound, the dirt path beneath my feet rough and uneven. It crunched softly with each step, but I was careful to place my feet on patches of softer earth and dead leaves, hoping to muffle any noise. My pulse thudded loud in my ears, every beat a reminder of what I was doing, following him, my brother, into the dark. I caught sight of him ahead, a shadow moving steadily along the path, the weak beam of a flashlight stabbing through the darkness. The light flickered as he walked, casting strange, shaky patterns on the tree trunks and bushes. He didn't walk fast, but he kept glancing over his shoulder every few steps. The way he looked back was not casual. His eyes were sharp, tense, as if expecting someone or something to be behind him. My own heart clenched each time he did it. I forced myself to stay still, pressing my back against a tree trunk, trying to blend into the shadows. The night was silent except for his footsteps, the dull thuds on the dirt path. No wind, no animals, just the crunch of his boots. The flashlight beam moved ahead, briefly illuminating patches of grass, the rough bark of trees, and the locked shed door that sat at the end of the path. I swallowed hard, my throat dry and tight. The cold felt like it was seeping into my bones, slowing my movements even as I tried to stay alert. He stopped in front of the shed and crouched down, pulling a set of keys from his pocket. The metal jingled softly, almost swallowed by the silence. He worked the key into the rusty lock with slow, deliberate movements, glancing over his shoulder again. I could hear his shallow breathing, careful not to be loud. I held my breath, my chest tight, muscles tense as I crouched behind an old pile of firewood stacked near the shed's side. The rough wood pressed against my back, cold and splintered. When the lock clicked, he pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, the flashlight beam disappearing. The door creaked softly, the sound dragging out longer than I expected. Then, silence. I stayed frozen, straining to hear anything, voices, movement, anything that might tell me what he was doing in there. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast. Suddenly, a faint noise came from inside the shed, a soft scrape, maybe the sound of something metal being moved or adjusted. I shifted slightly, careful not to make a sound, heart pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. The flashlight beam reappeared briefly, moving slowly across the shed's interior before going dark again. I could see the outline of his figure, bent over something low to the ground. His shoulders were tight, his movements quick but cautious. He stood up suddenly, as if sensing something, and I ducked lower. His head turned sharply toward the door, eyes scanning outside. I froze, barely daring to breathe, watching as he stepped to the door and peered into the night. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness in quick, jerky movements. After a few seconds, he closed the door quietly, locking it again with the same careful motions. I waited, heart racing, for what felt like forever. Then, without a sound, he turned and walked back the way he came, still glancing over his shoulder. I didn't move until his footsteps faded completely, swallowed by the night. The cold pressed in around me again, the silence stretching out, heavier than before. I felt the weight of whatever I'd just seen settle in my chest. Danger, but not the kind I could name. Only questions, and the growing fear that some things weren't meant to be discovered. The knocks came just after dawn, precise and deliberate. Not the hesitant tap of a neighbor or the clumsy pounding of a delivery, but firm, measured raps that echoed through the quiet morning. I was still sitting on the edge of the couch, the cold from the night clinging to my skin, when the sound pulled me from my thoughts. Each knock was followed by a pause, then another set, 3 then 2, as if someone was trying to get my attention without causing alarm. I moved toward the door, my heart already quickening, though I didn't know why. The knocks stopped, replaced by a low murmur of voices that I couldn't make out. When I opened the door, 2 officers stood there, uniforms crisp in the pale light, badges gleaming. One was a woman mid-30s, with a face that was both firm and patient. The other was a man younger, his eyes sharp and alert beneath the brim of his cap. They both carried radios clipped to their shoulders, the faint crackle of static barely audible. "Good morning," the woman said. Her voice was calm, steady. "We're with the police department. May we come in for a moment?" There was no urgency in her tone, but I saw the way her eyes scanned the interior behind me, taking in details without overtly searching. I stepped back and let them in, the air between us already charged with something unspoken. They stood near the entrance, hands visible, not aggressive but clearly prepared. The silence in the house deepened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. "Can you tell me where your brother is?" the man asked, cutting through the quiet. The question hung there, simple and direct, but it hit me like a weight. My brother. I blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing my face. I don't know. Last I saw him was yesterday evening. The woman nodded slowly, jotting something down in a small notebook. "We're following up on a report. It's important we know if he's been here recently." Her eyes didn't waver from mine. The room felt colder, though the windows let in the morning light. My parents appeared in the hallway, drawn by the voices. My mother's face was pale, her lips pressed tight. My father's hands clenched at his sides. The atmosphere shifted instantly. What had been a quiet house now felt taut, like a wire pulled tight. Everyone seemed to shrink into themselves, avoiding eye contact, waiting. "Has he mentioned anything unusual lately? Anyone he's been in contact with?" the man continued. His tone was clinical, but I detected an edge of urgency beneath it. I shook my head. "No. Nothing that I can think of." The woman glanced toward my parents, then back at me. "If you remember anything, please contact us immediately." She spoke plainly, without sympathy or accusation, just the facts. The radios at their shoulders emitted occasional bursts of static and short exchanges, low but persistent. It reminded me there was a larger world outside our house, one that had suddenly intruded on our quiet, ordinary morning. The officers stayed only a few more minutes, asking a few more pointed questions about my brother's habits and recent whereabouts. Each answer I gave seemed to deepen the silence that followed, as if every fact added weight to something none of us wanted to say aloud. When they finally left, the door closing behind them with a soft click, the house remained unervingly still. Words hovered unspoken. My family didn't move to speak, didn't look at each other. The tension was a quiet presence, filling every room, as if the house itself was waiting for what might come next. The officers arrived early the next morning, their faces grim and focused. They brought with them shovels, pickaxes, and a small backhoe that rumbled quietly as it was parked near the edge of the backyard. The air smelled damp and heavy, a mix of fresh earth and something older, darker, something I couldn't name at first. The ground was soft from recent rain, the soil rich and dark beneath my feet, but the thought of what lay beneath unsettled me more than the smell ever could. They began where the tip of the backhoe's arm marked the corner of the yard, near a patch of ground I had avoided as a child because it was always too uneven to play on. Watching the first shovelfuls of dirt come loose, I felt a hollow tightening in my chest. The officers worked methodically, the scrape of metal against earth punctuating the quiet morning like a slow drumbeat. One officer knelt beside a freshly dug hole, running his gloved hand along the edge. His face was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his concentration. A second officer tapped the soil with a trowel and motioned for the others to clear the area. When they removed the last layer, a dull glint caught my eye through the dirt, a fragment of metal corroded and bent. An old watch, its face cracked, half buried in the ground. My breath caught. I remembered that spot. It was where I had spent long summer afternoons, building forts from sticks and stones, pretending the world was smaller and safer. Now, those games felt impossibly distant, suspended in a nightmare I refused to fully acknowledge. The backhoe moved again, scraping deeper. The smell grew stronger, a pungent sour sting that made my skin crawl. I looked away, but the officers didn't hesitate. They uncovered a large rectangular wooden box, its surface swollen and rotted but unmistakably a coffin. The edges were splintered, and the nails protruded like jagged teeth. One officer called out quietly. They began to carefully lift the lid, revealing what lay inside. I could only watch as the scene unfolded, the weight of disbelief pressing down on me. The shapes inside were indistinct at first, shadows beneath the dirt and decay, but the unmistakable outlines of bodies emerged. The officers moved with practiced restraint, covering the remains with sheets to shield them from the morning light. I was rooted to the spot, every part of me screaming to look away, but unable to tear myself from the scene. The ground where I had once run barefoot, where I had chased my dog and collected wildflowers, was a graveyard. The realization was a physical blow. The innocence I clung to shattered quietly, replaced by an icy, numbing shock. Another box was found a few feet away. This one contained objects, small personal items, a child's shoe, a necklace tangled with dirt, a torn photograph whose edges curled and frayed. I recognized the shoe as one I had seen in my mother's old photographs, the necklace something she used to wear on special occasions. The proximity of these items to the bodies confirmed the worst. These were not forgotten accidents or distant tragedies. They were here, beneath the ground I had known, hidden in plain sight. The officers worked in silence, their faces set but their eyes betraying the weight of what they uncovered. I felt strangely detached, as if my mind was moving on its own, incapable of processing the full truth. The places I had once considered safe were now marked by death and secrecy. The soil beneath my childhood was soaked with stories I was only just beginning to understand. As the sun climbed higher, the digging slowed. The officers covered the holes with tarps, careful not to disturb anything further until forensics arrived. I stood apart, the earth still warm beneath my shoes, the smell lingering in my nostrils. The house behind me was quiet, its silence heavier than before. I struggled to find words, to make sense of what I saw, but none came. All I could do was stand there, feeling the weight of the past settle around me, knowing that the ground beneath my feet was no longer just dirt. It was a record of something terrible, a secret buried so deep it had taken years to surface. And I was left to live with the knowledge that the places I once called home had been hiding the unimaginable all along. I kept turning over the memories, trying to see them in a different light, but the truth was stubborn. It wasn't just a new story, it was a new version of everything I thought I knew. The nights when my brother had asked me to stay in the living room suddenly felt less like casual conversations and more like rehearsed scenes. There was the night last spring, the one right before my senior prom, when he called me out from my room to sit with him on the couch. I remember it clearly because I was reluctant. I wanted to be alone to get ready for the night, but he insisted. "Stay down here with me," he said, voice low, eyes fixed on the TV but not really watching it. I didn't question it then. I thought he just wanted company. Now, I see that he was setting up a story. Then there was the time during winter break, when I was home alone for a few hours after school. I remember he texted me to say he'd be out late and that if anyone asked, I should tell Mom and Dad he was home all night. At the time, I thought he was worried about them worrying. I said okay without much thought. I didn't realize I was agreeing to lie. Later, when I think about how he'd always call me right before he left the house, or right after he got back, I realized those phone calls weren't casual check-ins. They were checkpoints, proof that he was somewhere else while I was supposedly with him. One night stands out more than the others. It must have been the summer after my freshman year of college. I was home for a weekend, and he asked me to come downstairs around 10 p.m. The house was quiet, and the streetlights outside cast dull shadows through the curtains. I sat with him for over an hour, just talking about nothing much. I was tired, ready to go back to my room, but he kept steering the conversation toward making sure I'd cover for him if the parents asked. "Just say I was here," he said. "You know how Dad can get." I remember feeling uneasy but also caught up in the routine of it all. I didn't push back. I didn't ask why. Now, that conversation feels like a trap I walked into blindfolded. When I think back to family dinners, I recall how he'd glance at me, a subtle nod or a brief look that seemed meaningless then but now feels loaded with meaning. Those were moments of silent agreement, unspoken instructions. "If anyone asks, you know what to say." I was complicit in a script I didn't fully understand. There were times I told my parents simple lies like, "He stayed in the living room all night," or "I was here with him, he didn't go anywhere." I thought I was protecting him from minor trouble, not realizing I was part of a pattern that kept him free. The emotional impact hit me in waves. At first, I felt a mix of confusion and betrayal. How could I not have seen it? How had he used my trust, my presence, as a shield? The memories that once felt ordinary now felt manipulated. I was not just a sister, I was an unwitting accomplice. The house, the conversations, the silences, they all took on an oppressive weight. I remember the nights when I stayed up late, listening to his voice echoing from his room as he rehearsed alibis, and how I never questioned the need for them. I also realized how much I wanted to believe the best about him. That made it easier to accept his requests without suspicion. I remember thinking, he needs me. I'm just helping. But now I see that my willingness was exploited, that my presence was a tool in a plan I didn't know existed. It's a strange feeling, recalling specific moments where I gave him cover, only to understand those moments as deliberate acts of deception on his part. The hardest part is piecing together the timeline, fitting new meanings into old memories. What about the nights when I stayed downstairs, pretending to watch TV while I was actually waiting for him to come back? What about the anxious texts from my parents asking if he was home, and my automatic replies confirming his presence? All of those moments were part of a larger lie. And I was the one living it without realizing it. There's no sudden clarity, only the slow grinding shift of trust breaking apart, memory by memory. I'm left holding moments that once brought comfort but now bring doubt. The idea that I was unknowingly covering for him makes me question everything I thought I knew about my own role in the family. It's a cold realization, one that turns old nights into evidence and familiar faces into questions. And now, with this knowledge, every future conversation with him is shadowed by what I've uncovered, by the years he lived behind my silence. Sleep has become a fragile and elusive state. I lie awake for hours, often beginning with a tight knot in my chest that refuses to loosen. The darkness of the room feels heavier, pressing against my eyelids rather than offering the usual relief of rest. When sleep finally arrives, it is shallow and fragmented. I wake repeatedly, sometimes in the middle of the night, my heart pounding as if I've just faced a threat. The smallest noises, a creak in the floor, the hum of the refrigerator, jerk me from sleep, setting off a chain reaction of rapid breathing and sweating. This insomnia isn't merely about restlessness, it's a symptom of a mind that refuses to turn off, a mind stuck in vigilance that never fully relaxes. Hypervigilance has seeped into every aspect of my daily life. I find myself scanning rooms upon entering, noting exits, potential weapons, and people's body language in a way that feels automatic but exhausting. Conversations are a minefield. I'm constantly parsing words for hidden meanings or signs of deception. This heightened alertness doesn't come and go, it's a baseline state now. I catch myself flinching at sudden movements or loud voices, and my muscles remain tense, ready to react. The simple act of crossing a street can trigger an internal checklist. Who is nearby? What are they doing? Could they pose a threat? It's a mental burden that drains energy and leaves me feeling isolated, even in crowded spaces. Trauma responses are unpredictable and intrusive. Certain smells, like bleach or gasoline, can send me into a spiral of panic, my mind racing back to moments I'd rather forget. Sometimes I experience flashbacks, not the vivid cinematic kind people often describe, but sudden, fragmented images and sensations that disrupt whatever I'm doing. These episodes leave me disoriented and emotionally raw, often accompanied by nausea or dizziness. I've learned to recognize early signs, racing pulse, cold sweat, tightening throat, and use grounding techniques, but the relief is temporary. Avoidance has become a coping mechanism. I steer clear of situations or media that might trigger memories, but this narrowing of experience contributes to feelings of loneliness. Therapy has been a mixed experience. I sought professional help initially with the hope of finding clarity and relief, but progress has been slow and nonlinear. Sessions often bring up difficult emotions that linger long after I leave the room. There are days when verbalizing my experience feels cathartic, but other times it opens wounds that seem to resist healing. Trusting a therapist is a challenge in itself, given how deeply the betrayal from my past has affected my ability to rely on others. Some techniques, like cognitive behavioral therapy, have helped me identify distorted thoughts and reduce self-blame, but the underlying pain remains. Group therapy offered a sense of connection, yet I struggled to fully engage, wary of exposing vulnerabilities to strangers. Guilt is a persistent companion, quietly present beneath the surface of my thoughts. I replay interactions over and over, questioning if I missed signs or if I could have intervened differently. There's a nagging sense that by living with him as I did, I was complicit in some way, even though intellectually I understand that I was deceived and manipulated. This guilt doesn't manifest as clear-cut remorse, but as a diffuse, uncomfortable feeling that taints memories of more innocent times. It complicates my self-image and undermines my confidence in making decisions, especially those involving trust and safety. Distrust of others has become ingrained and automatic. I find it difficult to form new relationships or deepen existing ones. Conversations often feel superficial because I'm reluctant to reveal too much or let my guard down. I question people's motives, searching for hidden agendas or reasons to be wary. This wariness has strained friendships and family ties, creating a sense of isolation that feeds back into my anxiety. The fear of being deceived again is not just about physical safety but emotional survival. Rebuilding trust feels like a slow, cautious process, and setbacks reinforce the belief that vulnerability is dangerous. Living with the knowledge of what he did has fundamentally altered how I experience the world and myself. The psychological consequences are not sudden shocks but ongoing challenges that shape my daily existence. Each day involves navigating the tension between the desire for normalcy and the reality of trauma's lingering effects. There is no quick fix or neat resolution, only the gradual and often difficult work of reclaiming a sense of safety, agency, and trust in a world that now feels uncertain. The room where I saw him last was small, sterile, and suffocating in its quietness. It smelled faintly of disinfectant and something else, an undercurrent of stale air that made the walls seem closer than they should be. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the folding table that separated us. There were no windows, just a solid pale gray wall behind him, and on the other side, a heavy steel door marked with a small barred window. The kind of place designed to strip away any pretense of comfort or control. He sat handcuffed, his posture rigid, elbows resting on the table, fingers interlaced. His eyes, the same eyes I'd known all my life, were unreadable, cold, distant, and calculating. There was no sign of fear, remorse, or vulnerability. Instead, they held a quiet defiance, as if daring the world to break him. The faint lines around his mouth tightened every time I looked at him, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly, betraying a tension that didn't reach his expression but lived beneath it. His jaw clenched tightly, and for a moment, I thought he might say something, some defense or explanation, but he didn't. The only sounds were the occasional shuffle of a guard outside the door and the faint hum of the ventilation system. Our voices would have seemed out of place in that oppressive quiet, so we didn't speak. When the officer who'd arrested him stepped in to confirm the time, he gave me a curt nod but said nothing else. The atmosphere was cold, no warmth, no shared history, just two strangers divided by a table and a lifetime of unspoken truths. I wanted to see something human in him, some crack in the armor that might remind me of the brother I once knew. But there was nothing. His behavior in that room was measured, controlled, almost rehearsed, like he was performing a role he'd played before, or one he'd carefully constructed to protect himself. I realized then that the man before me was not the person I had loved or trusted. He was someone who had learned to hide behind silence and stillness, someone who had mastered the art of detachment to survive. That final moment, no words, no gestures, was the clearest evidence that the person I thought I knew was gone. The brother I saw was a stranger who had become a master of concealment, a man whose true self could only be measured by the cold precision of his actions and the unyielding calm in his eyes. He wasn't broken or lost, he was something else entirely, a calculated presence, shaped by choices I could no longer understand or undo.